Hello, this is Greg Allison, Green Greg. It's coming to you on the 28th of November, 21. Time on deck is 18:08 hours Central Daylight Time. And I have a special guest today that is David Pine. David Pine is the Director of Operations and the Deputy Director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security, serving with Dr. Peter Pry, who I've had on my channel many times. Many of you heard Dr. Peter Pry. Well, David Pine is also a military veteran. He's served in the Army as an officer. And he's got quite a story to bring to us, quite a perspective, something that you need to be aware of, something that will open your eyes, because he's bringing forth the prospects that we may be facing Russia and China at the same time. And if you don't believe that, just look at all the recent joint drills with Russia and China and how they've been going around Japan together with their Navy, and how Russia's actually kind of warned Japan about the Senkaku Islands that China claims. It also is claimed by China. So why is Russia getting into this? Why is Russia doing this? What is going on with these two powers, these two superpowers? We've calibrated our military. We've calibrated our defense to face one or the other. Our treaties are with Russia. And the idea that we get parity with Russia. What happens when China pops up and has maybe more weapon systems than we have? And so we are in a minority all at once before we know it. We're getting hoodwinked today. If we're not careful, it's going to put us in a very vulnerable position of weakness, which if you're the lamb in a room and you got two wolves, you don't want to be weak. Well, that may be where we're headed. So I'll bring you this video as part of my eyes wide open, head on the swivel series, guys. Bang the notification bell and click all to subscribe to my channel. And by the way, I do offer specials to help you prepare. You better think about it right now. With the food prices going up, this is going to be an investment in the future. And if the grid goes down, it's what we worry about. Well, the David Pry, Dr. Pry, and I and several other people is the loss of our power grid, and also now a superpower confrontation. Guys, if you're not prepping, you are in trouble. So I prep all you can. Right now, go to prepwithgreg.com, $100 off a 3-month supply of food that lasts 25 years. It's 2,000 calories a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. This is a deal that'll make you a winner, especially because it's lightweight. Yeah, you can put stuff up, but you're going to have a hard time moving and storing it like you can this stuff, especially in your bug out and your cache locations. So anyway, do everything you can. All that said, let's get on with David Pine here. David, you're an Army veteran. I thank you for that. You have come up with a paper that's talking about facing Russia and China together. Tell us about that. What are we facing?
Well, first of all, Greg, thank you for having me on the show today. Yeah, that's right. So I had a EMP task force paper that's really entitled, what America needs to do, what U.S. leaders need to do to ensure America's national survival. And that is available on the EMP task force site at emptaskforce.us. It's under the breaking news, most recent news area at the top on the right side of the website. And that's also been covered in a 4-part series that I published on the national interest just this past month. Specifically with regards to your question on Russia and China have been allies, unbeknownst to most Americans, since July 2001. So they've been formal military allies for the last 20 years. And they have an organization that's kind of Vladimir Putin, Russian President Putin, has called a reborn Warsaw Pact, and that's called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So that's the modern day equivalent of the Warsaw Pact. We don't really see that a lot in the news, but it's really kind of NATO's equivalent, and it's not just a European. Unlike the Warsaw Pact, it's not really focused merely on the European front. It's actually focused on both fronts. And as part of that alliance, it was initially purported to be a defensive alliance between Russia and China, but they had, according to some reports at least, there's part of that agreement is that a war with regards to China and Taiwan would be considered defensive, and a war between Russia and a former Soviet republic, aggression against a former Soviet republic would be considered defensive as well. And essentially, in both instances, if it was a war between Russia and NATO, China would come to Russia's aid, and if it was a war between Russia or China and the US or United Pacific allies, then Russia would come to China's aid. And so we have right now is a very dangerous prospect because, as we discussed prior to the show, there has been a massive Russian and Chinese nuclear and military buildup across the entire spectrum, which the U.S. has yet to match, and it includes nuclear missiles, a lot of different super nuclear weapons, super EMP weapons, which are nuclear weapons that are specially designed to have enhanced EMP effects to shut down our entire country with as little as one explosion over the US. Cyber weapons, which can have a very similar effect to EMP if done in a comprehensive cyber attack. And also biological weapons. China has been designing for the last 30 years, actually, since Deng Xiaoping, they've been trying to design a biological super weapon designed to kill off Americans specifically, but also US allies based on DNA.
Let's hold that point a minute. They are actually have the largest DNA database in the world. And all this 23andMe, all these gene things you're going to get and find out who your ancestors are, this data's, China's acquiring this data. And there's a lot of concern about the prospects, and they wrote about this. Chinese generals wrote about this, and I've covered this in the past, about prospects that they would try to develop a genetic weapon that would select various peoples, various ethnic groups, various races, and with all the genetic database they have, they might be able to get very specific about the effectivity of such a system. So there's a lot to be concerned about there.
Yeah, and that weapon has actually been, it's been, I guess, popularized in the latest James Bond movie, in which the villain, which is loosely connected to Russia, not to China, but loosely connected to Russia, wants to, use it, is mass producing such a DNA biological weapon, which is the map. They show a map, and it shows the U.S. like the DNA weapon only focuses on the United States, perhaps part of Canada, and then Western Europe. Right? Actually, every NATO country pops up on that map. So that's actually very similar. Sometimes reality mimics like popular, books or novels and vice versa. And we certainly see that in this movie. But so there's essentially 4 different ways the U.S. or that China and Russia could destroy the U.S. that we need to be very concerned about, and we need to be taking immediate actions, which I summarize and which I make recommendations for in my articles, as well as my EMP report or task force report on the website. And
can I pick on that just a minute? A lot of people come back to me and say, Greg, if China or Russia or somebody EMP'd us, we would make them a glass dinner plate. We would eliminate them. But here's the problem. All of our commands out there, submarines and so forth, they only launch if they receive that emergency alert message.
Yep.
Emergency activation message. It's EAM, I believe is what it's called. They have to receive that message now before they can even key in everything and launch the systems. They don't work without it. And that requires a working communications system worldwide. And there's many weak links in that system. And our industry, now I don't know, there may be some classified hardened standards today, and I hope they're adequate. But the old military hardened standard was to harden things to fit, and this is published, so I'm not giving classified information. What may be new, maybe there's some classified information out there, maybe they're doing better, and I hope they are. But the original standard was 50,000 volts per meter. And we're told by prior NASA administrator, who was acting administrator, and prior to that, a Soviet weapons systems expert, William Graham, who was head of the Congressional EMP Task Force and probably the top world's expert in EMP, actually was told by a former Soviet general after the wall fell that the Russians had produced EMP super weapons capable of generating 200 100,000 volts per meter. That's 4 times above our hardening standard. And just to make it all the more interesting, he said that we also gave that technology to North Korea.
That's right.
And we know China has it. So China, North Korea, who else has it now? EMP super weapons technology, which may render our ability to respond mute. We may just be floating dead in the water. I don't know. I hope I'm wrong.
So Dr. Peter Pry has suggested that very possibly Iran may have super EMP technology. One of the reasons that he's given is that they published a manual, I believe it was in 2010 or 2011, discussing the exact ways they would attack the U.S. With a super EMP weapon, that's a nuclear weapon exploded over the U.S. And so why would they have that doctrine? And he, according to Dr. Pry, their manual and their calculations were very accurate. And so why would they have that manual if they didn't have nuclear weapons? I've actually surmised, and he has as well, and a minority, I think, of the CIA, opinion of the CIA is that Iran has already achieved weaponized nuclear weapons.
Okay. I don't know if this is true, David. I don't know, and I don't know if you've heard this. But years ago, after the Soviet Union fell apart, there were a lot of unsecured weapon systems all over the Soviet Union. And I was told by a source, I don't know the accuracy of this, but I was told that Iran had gotten 2 entire missile launching systems, 2 missiles with nuclear warheads on it from Kazakhstan. And that was why Kazakhstan suddenly gave all their missiles back to Russia. They realized they couldn't secure them and they had a real problem there. And so they sent all their nuclear weapon systems back to, Kazakhstan was temporarily a nuclear state, but they decided they could not handle being a nuclear state. And the rumor I heard was that was after Iran got at least 2 of these. Now, some people said, well, how would Iran launch this? Well, Iran's working on advanced missile technology, but Iran has two other routes to this. One being they've already launched a satellite, and if using fractional orbital bombardment, where the satellite comes over, and the bombardment was it would re-enter the atmosphere and bomb a city. But if you're doing an EMP, it don't have to re-enter at all. So it's not really a bombardment, it's just fractional orbital. It comes overhead in its orbit and it's detonated overhead. The orbital altitudes are perfect. Height to radiate it out over the entire, almost all of North America. We get parts of Canada and Mexico too. So this is a real threat. But another thing is you could have smaller theater style missiles that could, not ICBMs, but the SLBMs that could actually go maybe to offshore from Venezuela. Venezuela is a very unstable nation. Iran trades heavily with them. And there's worries that already that Iran sending missile systems to Venezuela. There's a lot of concern about that in the intelligence community. If somebody went offshore from Venezuela and launched to America off the deck of a cargo ship, you wouldn't know necessarily, did it come from China? Did it come from Venezuela? Did it come from Iran? Did it come from Russia? Did it come from North Korea? It's because North Korea already had the Chonchongang tramp steamer running around in that area back in 2016. So what the world would it be? We wouldn't know who launched that. How would we respond if suddenly our lights go out? We wouldn't even see it coming. We're not monitoring to the south in that nature. So so we could be attacked from the south. And interestingly, I had a lady who had a vision, a dream of just exactly that thing happening. And she was a lady that milked cattle she milked cows for a living. She had no idea what an EMP was, but her dream was just right down to a T, just that. And when she told me, I was like totally on pins and needles. That, wow, how did you get this idea? Armchair strategists can't even come up with this.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you're absolutely right. There were reports that Iran purchased or acquired 3 tactical nuclear weapons from Kazakhstan prior to the 1994 accord, in which Kazakhstan agreed to surrender its nuclear weapons to the Russian Federation, along with Ukraine and Belarus, which were 4 nuclear successor states of the former Soviet Union. And so I would say that most likely those nuclear weapons were perhaps not in a usable state. They may not have had all the command activation codes that they required to use those. However, they could, most likely were able to reverse engineer those for their own weapons, perhaps even without actual nuclear weapons tests. Another possibility is that they cooperate very closely with North Korea in terms of missile technology. It's very likely that they've done so with nuclear technology as well, as their allies, informal allies. North Korea has tested a number of nuclear devices in their underground facility prior to, I think it may have been destroyed recently. But one of those very well could have been an Iranian device, nuclear device. So we do need to consider the fact that Iran very possibly is today a nuclear power. They do have, they are testing ICBMs. They haven't developed any yet, but they're on the path to do so. And they do have operational IRBMs, according to my latest assessment. And you're absolutely right. Whether it's Iran or North Korea, or China or Russia, obviously, China most recently tested a nuclear hypersonic glide vehicle in which could have bombarded the U.S. in a FOBS mode, as you mentioned, fractional orbital bombardment system mode, in which they could attack the U.S. from any direction. Any of the 48 states from space along would not involve a ballistic trajectory. It could be done from our southern border, which has, unlike our northern U.S. and Canada, has no early warning detection systems whatsoever. So that is a serious risk. We know that North Korea has been assessed to have at least two satellites that very likely have super EMP weapons, which could be detonated at the press of a button. So, we have EMP weapons above the U.S. And satellites that could be detonated at the press of a button with no warning whatsoever. We have a cyber attack, obviously a cyber attack, which is comprehensive against the United States, could be done as well with slightly less harmful effects. But either one of these weapons could be nation ending for our country. And a lot of people don't realize that. A lot of people don't realize that, the use of these weapons in war against us could result in the absolute breakdown of our national and state governments, and potentially the starvation of up to 90% of our population, as the food distribution and water distribution systems were knocked out of commission. And so that of course is part of the reason for the task force's existence. The EMP task force, which you are, a state director, has played a role for the last several years, trying to, educate the public and try to, educate policymakers as well, and to motivate them to take immediate action to defend our country against this kind of existential threat. And unfortunately, we've only had limited success. It's really, the American people assume the U.S. And actually many members of Congress that I've spoken to, have this assumption that the U.S. remains the greatest military power in the world, and that simply is completely inaccurate. It's an outdated assumption. Even if it was true 30 years ago at the end of the Cold War, it's certainly not true today.
How about telling us just how vast an array of weapon systems our nation is facing between the two powers and ourselves? I mean, with them building 350 to 400 new missile silos, it could take the DF-41 with 10 warheads each. China alone could be fielding 4,000 warheads there, in addition to what might be on their submarines, and they already have mobile DF-41s. Some people say, oh, well, they're not going to put missiles in all those silos because they're just doing that for deception, so you wouldn't know where they're at because they don't have that many warheads. And I think that's a deception, because they've already got mobile missile launchers. They don't need to do that. If they want to make sure they got missiles to launch us, they got the mobile fleet out there already. Right now, that's what they got. Is you see them on trucks as they parade them through Tiananmen Square every year. They have plenty of mobile DF-41s. There's pictures of them. I've got scads of pictures of those. Oh yeah, they could also launch that DF-17 hypersonic weapon, probably out of the Caribbean or Gulf of Mexico at us too, by the way, but that's another story. But what are we facing? Well, how big a threat are we facing, and what do you recommend to do about it?
So the threat we're facing is unprecedented. During the Cold War, we maintained what I like to call rough nuclear parity between the US and the Soviet Union. And that really was very effective in keeping the nuclear peace, from 1945 till the end of the Cold War in 1991 and beyond. Unfortunately, US leaders have pursued a very radical and dangerous policy of unilateral nuclear disarmament, which has seen the demolition or dismantlement of 94% of the US nuclear arsenal over the past 30 years, beginning
How
with
much? Whoa, how much?
94%.
We dismantled 94%.
That's right, 94%. So we had an estimated 30,000 nuclear weapons in 1991, December 1991. George H.W. Bush, with a stroke of a pen, he had an executive order which ordered 40% of them dismantled. And since, we've had other presidents, his own son, of course, George W. Bush, ordered the dismantlement of 50% of the arsenal he inherited from Bill Clinton, which was actually quite adequate. If we had just maintained our 2001 level of nuclear weapons, at that time we had 7,000 strategic nuclear weapons, more than sufficient to deter a nuclear attack from Russia and China. Today we only have 1,600, of which 300 are air launched and would be easily wiped out in a nuclear first strike, because we have 0 nuclear bombers on 24-hour strip alert. So, and as far as the magnitude of the threat, as you rightly mentioned, China has been identified as mass producing these 400 DF-41 ICBM silos. Each one of those DF-41s, of course, carry 10 warheads. So we're looking at anywhere between 3,500 and 4,000 additional strategic nuclear weapons, all of which are ready to fire. So the US nuclear arsenal has a maximum of 1,600 warheads today, but only about 720 of those are considered ready to fire, that being on nuclear or submarines that are actually at sea, and our 400 ICBMs. That number totals 720. So that would give China, once this nuclear buildup is completed by the Chinese, and that could happen as early as 2022, then they would have about 6 times as many ready to fire nuclear weapons than the US. This is unprecedented. We've never had an imbalance that large. And that doesn't even consider the Russian nuclear arsenal, which, Russia's nuclear arsenal is 5 times as large as ours today, if you count tactical and theater nuclear weapons. I typically don't. Russia and China's nuclear arsenals today, they have about twice as many strategic nuclear warheads. I believe that's the most important factor, or the most important measure of a nuclear balance. So fortunately, our inferiority, our nuclear inferiority, is much less on the strategic level today, but that's about to change within the next 2 years as both the Russians and the Chinese complete their nuclear buildups, which are far beyond anything the US has considered since the end of the Cold War. Now, the crazy thing is, you would think that when these revelations came out, we would have multiple conservative Republican members of Congress demanding that the US rebuild its nuclear arsenal as soon as possible to meet this threat. I am not aware of a single member of Congress that has echoed Peter Price, Dr. Price call and my own call to rebuild our nuclear arsenal. And that is very disturbing because essentially it means that Russia and China's nuclear supremacy is inevitable. If the US doesn't take some action to rebuild its nuclear arsenal, then we will be completely overmatched. And they will have the option to either use nuclear blackmail, simply say we have 6 to 10 times more ready to fire nuclear warheads, and we're willing to use them unless you do our bidding. That's kind of the best case scenario, right? Is they tell our president what they have to do, and they allow us to survive. But in my estimation, the number one the number one purpose of the United States military and of the President of the United States and Congress is to protect the American people. And so we have this overriding national security imperative is to ensure the survival of our nation as a free nation and to protect our, all of our 300+ million people. And the only way we can do that, certainly in the short term and perhaps any term, in the future, is to avert war with the Sino-Russian alliance. So the point of my recommendations is to adopt essentially a new national security strategy, which says, what can we do to essentially deconflict with Russia and China, and at the same time, avoid military provocations to them that would, lead to war, to a great power war, unconventional war, using these types of super weapons, and at the same time divide the Russian and Chinese military alliance, so that they start viewing each other as more enemies than they do us today. And that is something that is not really been explored by almost any national security strategist that I'm aware of. And I don't count myself as some brilliant national security strategist, but I am kind of an independent thinker. And I think these concepts have been used throughout history. The British Empire, in times where they were at risk of being overtaken by enemies, they came to accommodation with other great powers. Great Britain, they made accommodations with the Russian Empire at the time, the Japanese, the French, even the United States. They had conflicts over territories with all four of those great powers, including ourselves. And they resolved them and were able to preserve their empire and actually grow their empire throughout the early 20th century. And so that is kind of where we're at today. And what I proposed is that we kind of withdraw a pace from Russia and China. Right now, we are actively involved sending military, both ground and naval forces, and air units as well, to within their spheres of influence. And we'll, whether it's in the Taiwan Strait, that is extremely provocative. We've sent a lot of warships through the Taiwan Strait. Most recently, at the same time as the Chinese, aircraft carrier battle groups, we had our own naval exercises with our own aircraft carrier battle groups at the same time that the Chinese were doing it at this, in the South China Sea. And so, those types of actions increase the risk of a great power war, which is guaranteed, I think, to go to the cyber level, and very likely EMP and possibly even limited nuclear as well. All of which could mean the end of our country, and that's something that can be avoided. Both world wars, happen because of these great power alliances. That had not existed, then the wars would have remained regional. And I could go into detail about that. But it's kind of the same idea today. And so what I propose is that the US withdraw all military forces from Eastern Europe as well as East Asia. And that's kind of, I think, viewed as a kind of a radical idea, certainly within our national security establishment today. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we would acquiesce into a Russian and Chinese takeover of those regions, merely that we would definitely make it clear that we would not engage in military action over Taiwan or the former Soviet Union, because those areas or those countries are considered integral to Russia and China, and really the vital interests of those countries, as much as perhaps Texas or Florida would be considered vital interests to the U.S. today, or the Western Hemisphere, such Canada and Mexico. And so we need to really kind of see things through their eyes, because when it comes to preventing wars, it really doesn't matter what we think. It matters what the enemy thinks, what the enemy's perceptions are, what they are likely to react to, and what would cause them to wage war and to attack us preemptively. And a lot of people miss the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. I think part of U.S. intelligence got that right, and we just haven't heard the full story. But we don't have, U.S. intelligence has been infamously wrong on so many things. I mean, they've been caught flat-footed in almost every major war and disaster and attack that's occurred in the last 80 some years, 75, 80 years. So we can't trust U.S. intelligence to warn us, provide us fair warning of an imminent attack of this nature, which, as I mentioned, could occur within a matter of minutes, certainly within a half an hour, and disrupt and destroy our nuclear command and control system, so that potentially even shoot down Air Force One, or simply prevent the president's orders from being transmitted to our nuclear ICBM silos and our submarines at sea.
Yeah. So here's something a lot of people are going to come back with. So we already got enough weapons to destroy the world umpty times over. What does it matter? Why should we care? How's that going to make a difference? That's the typical response. But you and I believe in peace through strength. So how would you respond to that oft used phrase?
So I think some of the best articles on that have been written by Dr. Mark Schneider, former director within the Defense Department. And he has written articles discussing the fact that the Russians are hardening their ICBM silos to, I think, 25,000 to 30,000 PSI. The Chinese, all of the Chinese DF-41 silos are being built at 30,000 PSI. And what that means is that they could withstand near misses from nuclear missiles. So a nuclear impact that's not a direct hit, they would most likely survive. And we could have a first strike. We could hit their ICBM silos with near misses, and those missiles could still be fired back at us. So there's really two schools of thought when it comes to nuclear deterrence. One is what you call counter value. Counter value involves holding enemy cities hostage and essentially doing what we did to Germany and Japan in World War II, and that is just destroying entire civilian populations with no regard for the loss of lives of women and children. Or, and I believe that to be immoral, by the way, or to target their ability to make war and to attack us with their military strategic abilities, most importantly, their nuclear command and control, as well as their actual nuclear forces. And that, I believe, is what we need to do. And in order to do the former, you don't need a lot of warheads, assuming the enemy doesn't have ABMs, which they actually do. Russia has, by my estimations, thousands of ABMs, including now the recently deployed S-500, which is the most capable ABM ever built. So, we don't have, in order to defeat a massive ABM system such as Russia's, you need more warheads. You need more warheads, you need more missiles. And so that alone would demand that in order to have an effective nuclear deterrent based on counterforce, operations, you would have to build more missiles and warheads. So, but then with what China's doing, the imperative is so much greater. I would argue, and what I advocate, what we can do in the near term, within 6 to 24 months, we could reactivate all 2,000 of our strategic nuclear warheads in our inventory that are partially dismantled. So we actually have, as a hedge, for exactly this type of strategic contingency, 2,000 strategic nuclear warheads, which could be reactivated and redeployed on our nuclear ICBMs and SLBMs within a period of 24 months. So I argued for Trump to do that back a couple of years ago in an article I wrote in WorldNet Daily, and I continue to advocate that today. So that's a very important point. Another thing we could do is we could double the op tempo of our nuclear submarines from the current essentially 1/3 to 2/3, so that instead of having only 4 nuclear missile submarines, Ohio class nuclear missile submarines at sea, ready to fire at any given time, we'd have 8. And so that would double the amount of SLBM warheads that would most likely survive a nuclear first strike. So that's important. Another thing that I mentioned is we could build 5,000 ABMs, which are, based on our Aegis cruisers and destroyers. They only have a certain amount of missile tubes. I think it's only about 6,000. So that would essentially revolutionize their role, which is traditionally kind of, shore bombardment or else naval superiority, to really a strategic missile defense role in which they would be used, deployed around the world to shoot down missiles in their boost phase before the warheads could deploy. And they could very effectively defend America if we had that quantity of ABMs deployed on those ships. And that's off-the-shelf technology. We've already, the Navy has already purchased several hundred of those same ABMs, the SM-3 Block 2A ABMs. And so it wouldn't, would just involve essentially purchasing the ABMs themselves, which are, already being purchased. And that could be done with perhaps as little as $100 billion, $120 billion. And so, here we're, the Biden administration is talking about, this $5 trillion at least in new spending for, climate change, New Green Deal, human infrastructure, socialist boondoggle type of stuff. But if even 10% of that were utilized to actually defend America, and actually much less than that, probably 2%, 2 or 3% would be sufficient, I think, to rebuild our nuclear forces, over double the size, harden our grid and our critical infrastructure against EMP attack, as the EMP task force has been advocating, and also deploying these thousands of ABMs on our Aegis cruisers and destroyers. So those are some of the key recommendations I have in terms of actually rebuilding our strategic deterrent and defenses against these types of unconventional enemy attacks.
Well, that's quite a sweeping set of reforms you propose there. And just make a couple of things clear, just a couple of disclaimers here. One, David Prine nor I, either one, advocate war. That's the last thing, we've both been soldiers. Last thing a soldier wants is a war. But we're the first one to stand up and defend the country should we have to. We both had that job in our lives. And, we're doing it in other ways now. We're trying to make sure our country can be defended against the things that threaten us. And, in nature, the animals that are at most at peace are the big predators. And, if you remember back in school, it was the big guy who was always laughing and jovial because he knew nobody was going to jump on him and trounce him. So just because you're big and powerful don't mean you got to be mean and use the stuff. It's the little guys who crow the loudest and and try to act tough, but that's kind of dangerous. So, the thing to be is to be the big, strong, gentle giant, we hope. But right now we are being outclassed by either China or Russia, and together it puts us at risk. If they think they could launch strikes against us, especially with all these hypersonic missiles and EMP systems that would totally render our systems useless, then they may be tempted to do so. What we want is to make sure they don't have that temptation. Now, it is my theory that if we can hold off, David, if we can hold China and Russia off and not be in war with them, in just a few decades, their population is imploding so significantly that they're not going to be a threat to anybody, that the whole paper tiger will collapse and this will be gone. And maybe we can see a day that we can turn the swords into plowshares. But right now, we're facing a threat that is unparalleled in human history. The threat we're facing from China and Russia, even from China alone, or Russia, if we took Russia on, I have often myself advocated that we should make peace with Russia and use them to help strengthen us against China, because Russia's ultimate long-term enemy is going to be China because of the population and the vast, undefendable, relatively speaking, Siberian wilderness that the Chinese would love to have for their people and the resources. That Russia is probably at grave risk there in the long run. So Russia would be well served to make peace with us and work with us to keep China at bay, because Russia is they're losing population fast too, and they just don't have the industrial resources and the wherewithal that a nation like China has. And neither did Germany and Japan put together, neither back in World War II, match what China can put forward today. And back then we were an industrial powerhouse. We gave that up. We have won all our wars by attrition, and now suddenly we don't have anything to attrit with. We got our first off. Once we've been in a combat situation for a few weeks, we're running out of stuff. We're going to be in a severe hurt. So we've got to think about these long term if we want to maintain peace through strength. But hopefully one day we can get to the point we don't need all this stuff. It's terrible. We have to spend all this money and resources on such horrible weapon systems. It's horrible to know they're doing it more to me than anything else. A lot of our people like to spend all the time looking at their naval button and ourselves. But if you're going to have your eyes wide open, head on a swivel, and be aware of what's going on, you better know what's coming to you from outside. And that's what I'm concerned about. Is these guys they have a threat that they're putting in front of us, and I'm concerned that the language coming out of China, what they're telling their people, it seems to be a preparation to put them on war foot. I'm concerned that a lot of this energy shutdown is diverting energy to those industrial cities that are producing military goods, not the ones producing consumer goods, because they still have power. In fact, China's producing a record amount of power right now, which a lot of people don't know. So there's something really strange going on, and that really makes me wonder what we're up against and what we're coming at. So we better start paying attention real fast. We need to wake our politicians up, our military leaders, and quit playing all these games we're playing right now, and be prepared to defend this country.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I agree with you. In an ideal world, we would be able to deter China with Russian support. Russia and China have traditionally been natural enemies. They've had some clashes along their territories. Russia currently, part of Russia is former Chinese territories, both in the Russian Far East and in Siberia. So you would assume that would be a possibility. But the issue to bring that about, that would require very major concessions on the part of the United States. And foremost among those concessions would have to be a recognition of a Russian sphere of influence in the former Soviet Union, meaning that the only country that could use military power outside those countries within those countries would be the Russian Federation. And that is something that every president since the fall of the Soviet Union has conclusively opposed. In fact, Bush and Obama, they had this radical, provocative idea that we should have Ukraine join NATO as a full military member. And of course, if we had that today, we probably would have already had a war with Russia, because Russia and Ukraine remain at war in this undeclared low-level war in which Russia essentially has annexed Crimea, and they have seized control of eastern Ukraine as well, with their troops and their proxy forces. So there's no vital interest. Essentially what my strategy says is that we roll back U.S. defense commitments to cover only our vital interests. And traditionally, our vital interests have been described as the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, Western Europe, and Japan. Those are our primary vital interests, the most, Western Europe and Japan being some of the most, rich industrial regions, manufacturing regions of the world. And I think that we could continue to do that. We might have to make some concessions in the Korean Peninsula and in Taiwan, and certainly in Eastern Europe. As far as NATO is concerned, I think it would be in the U.S. interest to potentially, come to an agreement with Russia, whereby they leave their alliance with China, cut off all mutual assistance with Russia between Russia and China in exchange for a U.S. withdrawal from NATO. and then NATO would be transferred into an entirely European alliance, perhaps with Germany, with US aid, becoming a nuclear power. So we'd have, in that instance, we'd have Britain, France, and Germany, each small nuclear powers, potentially able to deter a Russian invasion of Europe without the US. And I think we've had this policy of non-proliferation agreements whereby we have every time that what Germany I don't think ever has, and certainly not Japan, but South Korea I'm sure, and definitely Taiwan would have wanted to be a nuclear power, perhaps even Japan, because they're so close to North Korea. And it would have been in the US interest to allow all of those states to become nuclear so they could effectively deter attack from Russia and China on their own without the need for US military involvement, because US military involvement in any of these potential conflicts would very likely lead to a Russian or Chinese, and likely a joint Russian and Chinese surprise attack using unconventional weapons that we've discussed on the US homeland, which, as I mentioned, would most likely be nation ending, as it would cause the collapse of the United States government.
There'll be collapse of the entire people. I mean, you mentioned 9 out of 10. The belief in that was briefed to the Congressional MP Task Force, and they briefed it to Congress that we would, within a year, lose 9 out of 10 people to societal collapse. I told
not at least. I'd like to be clear about it. That's not a minimum casualty figure; it's a maximum casualty figure. So it's possible it could be 50 or 60%. I think more likely would be in the higher range, but 90% would be the max casualty total. And that's just to let your listeners know, that's about 273 million Americans potentially dead.
Well, David, I think it's on the other side. I don't think that's a maximum. Here's why. Most of your farmers are growing market food today. If I've actually driven around and surveyed farms and looked from Google Maps, and what I'm discovering is, unlike when I grew up, when all the farmers had big gardens and grew their own food, that's not true anymore. Just a few do, just a few. And then people in the homestead movement are more likely to be growing their own gardens, because that's what the homesteads are all about. And a lot of my followers on my channel are homesteaders. A lot of preppers are homesteaders. So in the homesteading world, people are growing their food. But a lot of these people are not. A lot of these farms, if you go around out in the countryside and just start surveying them, you'd be surprised. I got videos where I'm just driving down the road in very rural areas and go, no garden, no garden, no garden, no garden. I mean, for miles, no garden, no garden, no garden, no garden. You won't see any garden. You can look down from Google Earth, same thing. So a lot of these people really are not prepared to feed themselves. And these big market crops are growing depend on tractors that need fuel to run them. The fertilizer is based on a fuel. All the pesticides, herbicides, and everything they're using, all these chemicals. And in fact, now they don't even save their seeds. They're buying their seeds as GMO seeds from another company. So anyway, just to cut it short here, that's the case. We have quite a threat here, and I think it could be a lot worse than what we think.
Yeah, we do.
All right. Well, look, in closing, we can do something about this. And you're making the recommendations. And I don't know if we'd ever get Congress to go along with all of them. If we start heading in that direction, then maybe, just maybe, we can maintain the world to the point that we survive past the point that these tigers have imploded, and things will be better. So pay attention to what we were saying here, and write your congressman. There's all kind of resources for writing Congress on my Freedom Restoration Foundation site. Tells you how to go about that. So avail that to yourselves. And I want to thank you, David, for coming on my channel and for communicating these risks and the ideas of what to do about them.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate you having me on the show. Just lastly, your listeners, I'd like to urge all of your listeners to go to our website again, emptaskforce.us. There you can find on the lower left a link to my EMP report. I'd encourage you to read through it and send it to your members of Congress, and encourage them to follow up on those recommendations, as well as Dr. Price, all of his excellent recommendations and his many books and articles that he's written on, available from our website as well.
All right. David, thank you very much. I hope to have you on here again. You've got a lot of good information to share with us, and I'm going to wish everybody an awesome day, and thank you very much.